Lords, I want to lay out my involvement in the global shipborne trade, terminal operations and the associated professions. Now, my private business trades from two terminals in the port of Sunderland, a council-owned deep water port, and in Great Yarmouth, a trust port, both of which are on the east coast. Now, through a joint venture, I bring tankers of liquid nitrogen fertiliser up to 50,000 tonne dead weight to Sunderland, and a YouTube video of one of my most recent shipments has had over 50,000 views, which I'm very pleased with. I received the draft bill of lading for my latest shipment last night, so I know what global shipping and trade is all about. Now, the draft policy starts on the premise that developments in trade should be underpinned by commercial principle and should be market-led. Well, that's absolutely right. But if only that were simple. Because not all ports operate on the same statutory or capital structure, so the purity of that market-led approach isn't quite what the policy would have you believe, mainly because it fails to recognise that particularly the trust ports, the largest cohort, are constrained in their ability to borrow, which constrains their ability to expand. Now, I was with the chief executive of the port of Dover last week, and he made that point very powerfully. His credit card is maxed out, and the policy needs to have regard to the particular needs of trust ports as opposed to the other operators. Now, that shouldn't be a problem, but the capital and structural differences between the ports have led to an oligopolist situation. It was just referred to by, I think, my noble friend, who said the top 20 operators have got 80% of the market, and that's resulting in a lack of competition, whereby any measure UK ports are uncompetitive against our near continental neighbours, a point that is important for Lord Mount Evans' transshipment point. So I asked a colleague in my industry trade body to provide me with some figures for the landed cost of bulk commodities on the quayside for two commonly used ship types based on the rack rate. Firstly, for a 4,000 deadweight tonne dry bulker compared with ARAG, Amsterdam, Rotterdam, Antwerp or Ghent, and to UK ports. It's 88 to 189% more expensive for the East Coast than ARAG, 213 more expensive than the South Coast, and for a much larger deep water 35,000 tonne deadweight handy-sized bulk vessel, it's between 123 and 200% more expensive on the UK East Coast, 250% more expensive on the South Coast, and a whopping 502% more expensive on the UK West Coast. In cash terms, £62,000 for Amsterdam, £311,000 for Liverpool. Now, that's a problem. It's a £250,000 problem for the UK economy, and this competitive disadvantage isn't referred to at all in the policy, and it should do, because it's damaging our ability to trade with and earn our place in the world, especially as we are now able to operate our own independent trade policy, which for many commodities, with a 6.5% tariff advantage on some goods over the EU default. It's in everyone's interest that we leverage this comparative advantage, but we can't because we're underported and the policy doesn't mention it anyway. So at this rate, we'll never get to the expected 62.5% increase in dry bulk. So, my lords, I'm doing my best to arrest the decline in the liquid bulk traffic. It's a number that doesn't intuitively sound right to me, given the huge volumes of LNG that are coming through Milford Haven. But put that point to one side. Look, the case for new ports infrastructure is made. We can't carry on without a dramatic increase in capacity and other break bulk opportunities, and we've got a fleeting moment of comparative advantage to seize. So we must do it. But we're here today because the 2012 policy hasn't worked. Now, I'm grateful for the British Ports Association for a short briefing, which told me that since the existing policy was published in 2012, only 4 consequential consents have been issued. I take that at face value. The policy highlights a number of pre-2012 extant consents that have not been built. The UK ports infrastructure is sort of beached, and we have to ask why. For all the obvious demand, have we just made it too difficult to expand existing ports or build new ones? Will the draft policy make it easier or harder to expand the ports our country needs? Now, moving on, I'm very surprised the policy, and I'm supporting Baroness Scott's points here, makes no reference to the astonishing ecosystem multiplier that supports the ports. For the most part, privately operated businesses, stevedores, cargo surveyors, ships agents, hauliers, warehouses, freight forwarders, customs agents, just to name a few. It's a massive sector. And the port policy is silent on this. I can't understand that. And in its analysis, the policy also, in my view, fails to make the distinction between the ports, the harbour authorities who maintain the navigations, provide pilotage and dredging for so forth, and the operators who occupy land and quaysides within a port from which they ply their private trade. So the preamble is completely incomplete in this regard. The order of battle is misunderstood, and I support the noble Lady Baroness Scott when she calls for a more fundamental redesign and recasting of this policy to give the richness of the texture of the industry that is, rather than just copy and paste the policy which sadly hasn't yielded fruit since 2012. Now, I would consider myself to be a terminal operator, and experience tells me why the UK doesn't have the dynamic ports and logistics infrastructure we might have. Now, back in 2019, I wanted to build a terminal in the northeast to handle liquid fertilisers. There was a significant upfront capital cost for tanks and a new local market to build from scratch. It was a risky operation. I couldn't go to the big five ports, and, my lords, this is a problem, because they'd only lease you land for 15, perhaps 20 years, and investing millions up front, only to hand back that asset after 180 months, so to the landlords, we can punt the opportunity on to somebody else, use the infrastructure you'd built and paid for and built the market, wasn't really a very good business strategy. And the facts are that the terms offered to users by most UK ports do not make it easy for private operators to make the long-term generational investment decisions to build businesses and trades, because there isn't enough choice or competition. So, my lords, we went to the port of Sunderland, a council-owned port where we were able to enter into a much more long-term partnership that made it easy for my business to develop a patient plan to build a market and to be rewarded for it. Now, you might say this is a case of the market-based approach working, and you would be right. But, my lords, for every port of Sunderland, and I can't praise them highly enough for their can-do attitude and customer focus, there are dozens of less accommodating take-it-or-leave-it ports, unconcerned about competition because there is such a structural shortage of supply. And that's a problem that this policy should grip, because they have a market failure in that terminal operators are unable to secure the premises on long leasehold or perhaps freehold basis in the UK to grow our trade. Now, just as an aside, if I may, because I'm looking at the clock, I might say I do welcome the points about free ports, but I am expressing surprise that the opportunity for customs warehouses hasn't been appropriately recognised. A customs warehouse is like a free port, but just for a single warehouse or an individual terminal located within a port estate. And I've got one of these, and I want to give credit to HMRC and thank them for putting their shoulders to the wheel to drive my trade forward. And it's invidious to name names, but the trade taxes team in Manchester know who I'm talking about. There was a part of the state who actually understood the need for trade, who worked collaboratively and positively, and that opportunity for customs warehouses should be publicised more, and I'm astonished it's not at all in the policy. So look, I support the broad thrust of the first 16 pages, and I would, whilst suggest some re-emphasis on some of the points, but I think we can all agree that ports are important, we're underported, we need more competition, we're missing out on global trade, and we need to have a wider variety of types and tenures within the market-led approach. So this is the lens through which I approach the 66 pages that follow that essential preamble. Oh dear. Very briefly, we have 9 pages talking about how an applicant might confidently demonstrate the commercial, wealth creation, tax-generating, economic and socio-economic basis of the proposal. And then we had 57 pages on the need for the various appraisals, surveys, analysis, attempting to prove the unprovable. And it's all very worthy and well-meaning, but wholly counterproductive, and at odds with the overarching imperative to get trade flowing and the economy moving. Now, I read it again, and I suppose I should have taken comfort from paragraph 242, where the Secretary of State should start with a presumption in favour of granting consents to applications. Good. Unless other policies in this NPS provide a clear reason for refusal. Bad. So after the 9 sort of positive pages, the trouble is that in every one of the 57 followings, is a clear reason to refuse an application, and on reasons that can be confected. And the cumulative effect of any of them is enough to topple any proposal into the drink. My Lords, we have been sitting through the Planning and Infrastructure Bill, with a lot of the well-meaning but counterproductive proposals in Part 3 that will slow down development, not speed it up. So I'd like to listen to my following remarks through the lens of the Chancellor. I can't believe I'm saying this. Quoted today in the Times on the day the government has apparently consigned much of this nature-based bureaucracy to the deep. She says, the outdated planning system has been gummed up by burdensome bureaucracy and held to ransom by blockers for too long. Our pro-growth planning bill shows we are serious about cutting red tape to get Britain building again. Well, at last. And I take her comments at face value, but we need to do the same with this policy. Because I've read the Hutchinson's report's response to this consultation. And not only are so many of the outside the port's requirements unprovable, but required, even once a consent might be granted, the costs of the conditions still aren't known. So even if you spent all your money on the surveys, traffic analysis, hydraulic predictions, and got your consent, you've still got no idea what it might cost. It's only at that point that the bills start coming in. My Lords, you have to question the value of some of these surveys. Now, in Galston-on-Sea, from where I take my territorial designation, they built an outer harbour in the early 2000s. I remember there were dire predictions from the world's leading hydrological practice that Galston Beach would be scoured away, and that warning held up the proposal for many years. My Lords, the harbour's been built and the beach is as wide as it's ever been. But it's the beach at Hopton, just down the coast, that's copped it. The crime is that so many people believed the expensive report in the first place. And here lies a problem. An expensive report based on arbitrary precision and dodgy modelling misdirected the whole investment process. So is it any wonder we haven't had a significant new port development delivered in the last 15 years? Will this policy make it any easier? The whole tone of the policy presupposes that ports are, by their very nature, bad things for the environment. And that's a false premise. Keeping shipping channels open with dredging speeds the flow of water out to sea and removes sedimentary contaminants. The wildlife habituates. Now, that's not an argument for no regulation, but we need to return to a sense of proportion. And £1.2 billion spent on environmental reports for the Lower Thames crossing proves we've gone too far. We just can't afford it. Biodiversity net gain sounds so nice, and it's good on land, but it's totally unproven and unprovable in the tidal marine context. And whilst we try and work it all out, the key deals for wind turbine installation and oil rig decommissioning are all being sorted out over the water by 2028. We're at risk of missing the boat. Absolutely. And then I read there are restrictions on port development in flood zones. Well, guess what? Show me a port that isn't in a flood zone. That's not well-meaning. That's wholly counterproductive. And I don't think the NSIP process, although I welcome it, is going to help that much, because it's not going to whittle down that 57 pages into a more sensible number. It's just less through wading mud, more like stuck in the mud. It's like the whole policy was written by that other great seafaring nation, the Dutch, a competitor nation that is not known for its ambivalence towards the environmental protections, and much of it which is beneath sea level. Look, we have a document that pays lip service to economic development but strangles it in red tape, a statutory charter for the objectors and blockers. As the Chancellor said this morning, we need to show investors we are a country that gets spades in the ground and our economy moving. So what to do? I think we need to think about this policy very hard and how serious we are about growing the economy, driving global trade and earning our place in the world. The policy proposal, in my view, places so many risk factors and hurdles that only those with the deepest pockets can contemplate expanding their port, and that really wipes out the trust ports and the smaller private ports. Consultees broadly welcome the draft presumption in favour of port development, and so do I, but it must be bolstered with a sequential test that starts with the overwhelming weight to port development that our island nation requires, a clear presumption in favour of trust ports, obviously weight given to safety and security. I've probably got 20 seconds to go, Madam Chairman. Would you like me to continue? Yeah. And, of course, in terms of the environment, whilst you need to sacrifice some small areas to grow the economy, insofar as the environment is concerned, an overriding recognition that sea freight is the most environmentally benign form of transport, and the leveraging existing infrastructure, like a more intensive use of existing channels, is clearly a mitigation to which nature has habituated. So we... Okay.
Fuller.
Yes, thank you. Yes, vision. Look, if we're really serious about the growth in the UK ports sector, I did ask the Minister to take a knife to the now discarded copy and paste parts from part 3 of the Planning and Infrastructure Bill, and a significant rewrite is indicated, and I think there's a consensus amongst noble lords in this debate that we should do, because otherwise we're going to have another lost decade in ports, a trade drag anchored 20 years back. We should be the seagull soaring, but unless there is a rebite, this policy will be an albatross around our neck.